The spring winds of 1872 swept across Black Mesa like a tired old preacher's, slow, dusty, and full of stories nobody asked to hear. They carried sand, tumbleweeds, and talk. A whole lot of talk. And for the first time in many years, the talk wasn't about drought or cattle thieves, or which rancher had lost another roof to the wind. This time every whisper, every murmur, every excited nod concerned Arthur Greyhawk, the Apache widower who lived alone in a weather-beaten cabin, half sunk into the foothills. For as long as folks remembered, Arthur had worn the same pair of cracked boots, the same patched shirt, and that same distant expression in his coal-black eyes. He spoke little, preferred the company of silence, and kept mostly to himself, since the fire that took his wife and child. Some pitied him, some feared him, and others simply forgot he was there. But all of that changed in a single afternoon. Arthur had gone down into the old coal drift near Rattlesnake Bluff, a place he'd dug through for years, hoping to find just enough fuel to warm his stove at night. The drift was narrow, barely tall enough for a man to stand upright, and the smell of old soot clung to the air like a curse. He swung his pickaxe in a slow rhythm, steady as a church bell, chipping away at the blackened rock. One strike rang different, hollow. The sound echoed through the tunnel, bouncing off the walls like a warning or an invitation. Arthur stepped back, squinted at the narrow crack his pick had opened, and struck again. This time the wall split wider, revealing something round and clay-brown hid deep beneath the coal. A pot. He dragged it out, breath caught somewhere between his lungs and his throat. The jar was heavier than he expected, so heavy he nearly dropped it. When he pried the lid off, sunlight from the mouth of the tunnel glinted off what lay inside. Not stones, not relics. Gold, a whole pot of it. Coins, nuggets, dust, more than he had ever seen in his life. More than most men would see in 10 lifetimes. And with that discovery, the spring winds of Black Mesa had their juiciest story in decades. By sundown, the town was buzzing like a summer beehive. That Apache struck it richer than a railroad baron. They say he found enough to buy every acre from here to Tucson. Bet he moves into a fancy house, now silk curtains, velvet furniture, the whole shebang. But late that evening, as Arthur stood outside the general store, buying nothing more than flour, a spool of twine, and kerosene, someone finally asked the question everyone had been itching to say aloud. So Greyhawk, a ranch hand named Miller, drawled, leaning one elbow against his horse, "What are you fixing to do with all that gold? Build yourself a palace." Arthur's answer was quiet, too quiet for such a loud rumor. "I've lived poor all my life," he said. "Gold don't change who I am. What I need is a wife worthy of keeping it when I'm gone." Those words dropped into the street harder than a cast-iron skillet. A few folks blinked. A couple coughed. One woman gasped so loud you'd think she swallowed a fly. A wife? A wife to keep his gold when he's gone? That sounded to many like a man preparing to die, or at least preparing to let go of the world. And soon enough, the rumor stretched itself longer and louder than the Santa Fe rail line. By the next morning, the talk had reached the worn, sagging porch of the Dobson household, a weather-gray place where Victoria Dobson had raised 2 daughters alone after her husband died, leaving her debts, hard work, and dreams she never spoke of anymore. When Victoria heard the rumor, she almost dropped the wet shirts she was wringing out. "Girls," she hollered, "you hear this? Arthur Greyhawk, rich as a silver mine, now was looking for a wife." She rushed inside, as if a cyclone were chasing her, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with sudden hope. Her gaze landed on her younger daughter first, Sloane Dobson, 20, sweet, fair-haired, bright as a morning lily. People praised her beauty the way they praised good weather. Victoria clasped Sloane's hands. "Oh, honey, you're perfect for this. So young, so beautiful, so promising. Then reluctantly Victoria looked at her older daughter, Sophie Dobson, 25, quiet, thin, face marked by old bruises and the sorrow of a marriage that had nearly destroyed her. A woman returned home not as a bride, but as a burden. Victoria sighed, the kind of sigh that carried disappointment and habit more than intention. Sophie, you can stay with me. Sloane has the better chance. Well, child, things are different for you now. The words weren't cruel, but they cut deep. Sophie lowered her head, the sting of shame rising like a tide. She slipped into the old tool shed, caught on an overturned crate, and buried her face in her hands. Maybe happiness just isn't meant for me, she whispered into the warm, dusty air. Outside, the wind kept blowing. The same wind that had carried news of Arthur's gold now carried the hope of some, the envy of others, and the grief of a woman who believed life had passed her by. But fate in the Wild West had a way of shifting like sand dune, quietly, unexpectedly, and all at once. And by the time the sun rose the next morning, Sophie Dobson had no idea her life was about to change with the beat of a single horse's hooves. Word travels fast in a small western town, but nothing travels faster than the promise of a rich man choosing a bride. By dawn the next morning, the people of Black Mesa were already drifting toward the dusty main road, whispering like wind through dry grass. Children sat on fence rails, boots dangling. Old men leaned on hitching posts, chewing tobacco with renewed purpose. Women straightened aprons, craning their necks toward the hills. They were waiting, every last one of them, for Arthur Greyhawk to ride past the Dobson house. And inside that house, 3 women prepared for a moment that none of them understood the weight of. Sloane stood before a cracked mirror, smoothing the pale blue dress she'd chosen. Her golden hair fell in loose curls around her shoulders. Her cheeks were touched with a soft blush. She looked like hope made flesh youthful, promising everything a man might want on his arm. Victoria bustled around her, fussing with ribbons and straightened hems. "Oh, honey," she murmured, brushing lint from Sloane's sleeve. "He won't be able to look away. You'll see. You'll catch his eye the second he rides through." Her eyes glowed with dreams of stability, comfort, maybe even a way to lift her family out of the years of barely scraping beef. And then there was Sophie. She moved about quietly, tying her shawl, smoothing flyaway strands of hair, though nothing could hide the tired circles beneath her eyes or the sadness gathered in her expression like dust in the corners of an old room. Sophie had not dressed up. She had not braided her hair neatly. She stood as though expecting nothing, because expecting nothing hurt less than hoping for something. Victoria glanced at her only once. "You look fine," she said, though the hesitation lingered like a shadow. "Just stand beside us. But remember, Sloane has the better chance. Men are drawn to beauty, not..." Sophie lowered her gaze, nodding once, quietly swallowing the familiar ache. Outside, the townsfolk were whispering louder now. "Here they come. Bet you $10 he picks the younger one. She's sweet as honey and pretty as spring. Hard to pass that up." Poor Sophie, life's already dealt her a bad hand. Can't see any mangold or no choosing a woman beaten down by life. Sophie heard some of it. She didn't flinch. Life had trained her not to. Victoria and Sloane stepped proudly onto the porch, standing tall and composed. Sophie followed, folding her hands in front of her, like someone trying to take up as little space in the world as possible. The road lay wide and quiet before them. Then came the sound, soft at first, then steady as a heartbeat. Arthur appeared, guiding his bay horse with calm precision. He wore the same worn boots, the same mended shirt, the same unbothered look as always. Richest man in the county now, and he still looked like he'd stepped out of a coal shaft. People waited for him to dismount in front of Sloane, because of course he would. And Arthur did slow down when he reached the Dobson porch. His dark eyes flicked to Sloane. She lifted her chin, smiling just enough to show confidence but not arrogance. Then Arthur's gaze moved to Victoria. She smiled broadly, almost triumphantly. And then, his eyes drifted past them, to Sophie. She stood slightly behind the others, half shadowed by the porch beam, her shawl loose around her shoulders, her hands wringing nervously. Arthur's expression changed. He softened, steadied as though something quiet inside him recognized something quiet inside her. He stepped down from his horse. A hush fell so deep that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Arthur walked right past Sloane, walked past Victoria, walked straight to Sophie. Sophie's breath caught. She stared at him, as if he'd made a mistake, as if any second he'd step back and correct himself. He didn't. Slowly he took her rough, work-worn hand in both of his. The gesture was gentle, almost reverent. Before the entire crowd, before her stunned mother and furious sister, Arthur lifted her hand and pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles. Gasps rippled like thunder across the street. Sophie whispered, barely able to speak, "You want me?" Arthur held her gaze, steady and unshaken. "Miss Dobson, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The town erupted in shocked murmurs. He chose the wrong sister, didn't he? No, maybe the man's blind. Sophie, the older one, the returned wife. What in God's name is he thinking? Sloane's pretty smile faded as swiftly as a candle in the wind, her hands balled into fists, her breath tightening with disbelief. Victoria stepped forward, flustered. "Sir, are you certain? Sophie is, well, she's been married once before. She's a widow in a sense, or rather returned." Arthur turned his head slightly, calm as a man discussing the weather. "Ma'am, I need a wife, not a vase to decorate a parlor." Sophie stared at him, confusion and fragile hope warring inside her. "But my sister is prettier." Arthur didn't even glance toward Sloane. "Pretty don't keep a home warm when winter settles in. Pretty don't tend a husband when sickness knocks. Pretty don't understand loss the way you do." Sophie felt something inside her shift, something long buried, long silenced. She swallowed. "You're asking me? Truly?" Arthur nodded once. Truly. The town stood frozen behind them, jaws dropped, hearts racing, minds scrambling to make sense of what they had witnessed. A poor Apache, now rich beyond measure, choosing the woman whom the world had rejected. It didn't make sense to them, but it made perfect sense to him. Sophie had never packed for a wedding she didn't believe she deserved. Her hands trembled as she folded what little she owned. 2 faded dresses, a worn shawl, a cracked mirror she kept only because it once belonged to her grandmother. Everything fit into a small canvas bag. She had lived 25 years, survived a cruel husband, endured whispers and pity. Yet her life could be carried in a single arm. Sloane stood in the doorway, arms crossed tightly against her chest, lips pressed into a thin, trembling line. "You're really going," she said, not as a question, but as an accusation. Sophie didn't answer. She tied the bag closed and set it gently on the floorboards. Sloane's eyes flashed. "Of course you are," she spat suddenly. "Of course it's you again. Why is it always you?" Her voice cracked, loud enough for half the street to hear. "First you married into money, now you get another rich man. Why does everything fall in your lap when I'm the one people admire?" The words struck Sophie like thrown stones. She swallowed hard, turning away, so Sloane wouldn't see the sting in her eyes. "I didn't ask for this," Sophie whispered. Sloane stormed forward, snatched Sophie's bag, and hurled it out the door. It landed in the dust with a soft thud. "There," Sloane cried. "Go on. Take your good fortune and leave us behind." "Sloane!" Victoria hissed, rushing to grab her younger daughter by the arm. "Stop this right now." But Sloane jerked away, cheeks flushed with fury and hurt. "It's not fair, Mama," she shouted. "I'm younger, prettier. Why doesn't he want me?" Victoria glanced between her daughters, Sloane lovely and furious, the other seethed and bruised by life, and something conflicted flickered in her face. But her practical nature, honed by years of scraping by, quickly resurfaced. "Hush, child," she scolded, though her tone softened. "This is a chance for all of us. Arthur's gold could lift this family out of debt. Sophie marrying him is a blessing, even if there's no love involved." She turned to her elder daughter. "Sophie will manage, she always has." Sophie heard it clearly. "You marry for us, not for yourself." Something inside her wilted. She bent to pick up her bag from the dust. When she straightened, Arthur stood a few steps away, as if he'd been waiting out of respect for her family's private quarrel. He said nothing about Sloane's outburst, nothing about the bag lying in dirt. He simply extended a hand. "Sophie," he said quietly, "are you ready?" She nodded, though her heart felt heavy and uncertain. She took his hand, let him lead her away from the porch she had once returned to in shame. Sloane watched from the doorway, eyes filled with a mix of longing, anger, and something that looked painfully close to regret. Victoria, still gripping her apron, forced a thin smile. "Do your duty, Sophie," she murmured. "Make a good life. We'll be fine here." Sophie didn't answer. She couldn't. She walked toward Arthur's horse as though stepping from one world into another. Arthur's cabin sat a mile beyond town, tucked between leaning pines and red stone. When they arrived, Sophie paused at the sight of it. The house was smaller than she'd expected. The roof sagged on the north side. The front step had rotted halfway through. The boards along the walls were gray, swollen from years of rain, and an old stovepipe leaned like it was too tired to stand straight. "This," Sophie murmured, "this is where you live?" Arthur slipped off his horse, landing in soft dirt. "Has been for years," he replied. "But you found a whole pot of gold," she said, incredulous. "You could build a mansion. Why stay here?" Arthur removed his gloves, his face unreadable. "I lived in comfort once," he said. "Had a warm house, fine things, a family." His eyes drifted toward the tree line, as though seeing ghosts moving between the branches. Comfort didn't save them when the fire came. Sophie's breath faltered. She didn't push him. Grief was something she understood, a language with no words. Arthur stepped toward the cabin door. "I don't want love in this house," he said suddenly, almost like a warning. Sophie blinked. "Then why did you marry me?" He looked at her, not harshly, but truthfully. "Because loneliness eats a man alive. I needed someone to share the space, to manage the gold if I decide to go." "To go?" she repeated. "Go where?" He didn't answer. Anger rose warm in her chest. "So that's it? You found gold and think you can buy a woman to watch it?" He gave a small, crooked half-smile. "Least I bought one with spirit." Sophie scoffed. "Spirit? No. I just don't enjoy being purchased." Arthur pushed open the cabin door. "Come inside. It ain't much, but it keeps the rain off." She hesitated, then stepped past him, entering the shadowed space that would now be her home. The floor creaked under her boots. The air smelled of old smoke and pine sap. Only one bed sat in the corner, covered with a patched quilt. A single window let in a narrow slice of afternoon light. "This is the life you chose," Arthur said quietly behind her. Sophie turned, meeting his gaze for the first time since they had left town. "No," she said, lifting her chin just a little. "This is the life I'm giving a chance." Arthur looked at her for a long, unreadable moment. Then, almost too faint to notice, he nodded. Outside, the afternoon sun settled lower on Black Mesa. Sophie stood in her new home, unsure of what the future held. only knowing that nothing in her life would ever be the same. And somewhere deep inside, the silence of that worn little cabin, something fragile, something long buried, took its first breath. The first week of marriage passed like a long stretch of unsettled weather, neither storm nor sunshine, just an awkward drifting of two strangers forced to share the same four walls. Sophie cooked. Arthur chopped wood. They spoke little. Sometimes Arthur forgot there was another person in the house. Sometimes Sophie felt she was living with a bear who'd been taught just enough English to argue. But the land had its own rhythm, and by living side by side, they slowly fell into it, even if neither was ready to admit it. One afternoon, a soft rain began tapping on the cabin roof. Then it turned harder. Then harder still, until the roof began dripping in a dozen tiny streams. Arthur muttered under his breath, grabbed a hammer, and carried a handful of shingles outside. "You stay in," he told Sophie. "This won't take long." She was already preparing her bath, heating a kettle of water on the stove. The steam curled around her face, easing the aches in her shoulders. Inside the cabin, she hummed a tune, nothing cheerful, just something quiet from childhood. She poured the warm water into the wooden tub, testing it with her fingertips. At last, she undressed and stepped in with a long, tired sigh. Outside, Arthur climbed up the ladder and set to work tightening loose shingles. The rain had let up, leaving behind damp boards slick as soap. He braced his boots against the roofline, leaned forward, and adjusted a stubborn shingle. That was when he looked down, straight through the narrow gap in the window below. His breath caught. Sophie, completely unaware, was bathing, shoulders glistening with suds, hair loose for the first time since he had met her. The lamplight made her skin glow warm, soft, human in a way he had never allowed himself to notice. Arthur jerked so hard he nearly dropped his hammer. Then he slipped. The ladder rattled beneath him as he flailed, arms windmilling, before he toppled backward and hit the ground with a muddy thud. Inside, Sophie gasped at the noise. She snatched a towel, wrapped herself, and rushed to the window. Her eyes widened. Arthur lay sprawled in the wet dirt. Without thinking, she flung open the window and, still dripping, splashed the entire bucket of bathwater onto his face. "You," she choked out. "Were you spying on me?" Arthur sputtered, wiping soap and rain from his eyes. "No, I wasn't looking." "You fell because God saw you looking," she snapped. Arthur sat up, drenched and miserable. "I fell because the roof is slippery." "Then stay off it while a woman's bathing." "Then don't bathe when I'm fixing the roof." She slammed the window shut so hard the frame rattled. Arthur lay flat again, staring at the gray sky, and murmured, "Lord help me." From inside the cabin came her final shout, "And fix that ladder." 2 days later, Arthur came down with a fever, nothing dangerous, just the sort that settles deep in a man's bones after too many nights sleeping in cold, damp blankets. He insisted he was fine, but by the afternoon, he was lying flat on the bed, sweating, shivering, and cursing under his breath. Sophie sighed. She didn't want to care, but she found herself caring anyway. She set about making him soup, something simple to ease the fever. But Sophie, well, cooking had never been her strong suit. Her first husband hadn't allowed her near the kitchen. Years of fear had left her second-guessing every pinch and spoonful. She tasted the broth. Bland. She added salt. Still bland. So she added more. And more. And yes, she added the entire tin. When she brought him the steaming bowl, Arthur sat up with the dramatic misery of a dying outlaw. "Eat," she ordered. He sniffed it. His eyes watered instantly. "Dear God, woman, what?" "Don't complain. You're sick." He lifted the spoon, took one heroic sip, then gagged so violently the bowl nearly flew from his hands. "What is this?" he gasped. clawing for his water cup. It's soup. This is brine. This is salt water, straight from the devil's own pond. She crossed her arms. I tried. Try less. She glared. If you'd chosen my sister, she'd have burned the house down trying to boil water. At least I attempted to cook. Arthur wiped his mouth, coughing. You're terrible at everything. And you're terrible at living. Their eyes locked, two stubborn souls refusing to back down. Then, to Sophie's surprise, Arthur laughed. Just a short huff of air, but a real laugh nonetheless. It unsettled her more than his yelling. That night, the fever worsened. Arthur tossed and turned, mumbling in Apache and English, both haunting. Broken words Sophie didn't fully understand. By midnight, he jolted upright with a guttural cry, sweat rolling down his temples. His chest heaved. His hands shook. The fire. His weaves. His jolt. He saw it all again. But then, he saw something else. Sophie, hunched over in a chair beside the bed, fast asleep, with a damp cloth slipping from her hand, and a bucket of cool water beside her. Her face was pale with exhaustion, strands of hair clinging to her cheek. She looked like she had stayed awake for hours, tending him until sleep finally claimed her. Arthur stared at her in stunned silence. She could have left him, could have slept soundly in the other room, could have ignored his fever, ignored his nightmares, ignored his grief. But she hadn't. For the first time since the fire that destroyed his world, Arthur felt something shift deep in his chest, not sharp like pain, not heavy like sorrow, but warm, a warmth he had long forgotten. He lifted a trembling hand and brushed a stray lock of hair from Sophie's face. She didn't stir her. Why would you stay? He whispered hoarsely. For a man like me. The room had no answer, but Arthur already felt it taking root. Something was changing. Something small. Something fragile. Something that neither of them, broken as they were, could afford to ignore much longer. The morning after Arthur's fever broke, Sophie woke with a stiff neck and cold hands. She blinked, momentarily confused, until she realized she had fallen asleep beside the bed, slumped awkwardly in the chair, blanket half draped over her. Arthur was awake and watching her with an expression she had never seen on him before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't annoyance. It wasn't even gratitude. It was quiet, gentle, almost reverent. Sophie jolted upright. You're awake. Arthur nodded. Seems so. She reached for the washcloth automatically, dipping it into the cool water, wringing it out the way a nurse might. He caught her wrist not harshly, but firmly enough to stop her. Sophie, he said, voice rough from sickness, and something deeper. You didn't have to stay up with me. She swallowed. Someone had to. He released her wrist slowly, as though letting go of something fragile. I'm not used to care, he said. Well, she replied, attempting a shrug though her cheeks warmed. Neither am I. A silence fell between them, found full, not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that lets two people breathe the same air without feeling crowded. Arthur cleared his throat. About the soup. Sophie cut him off with a glare. If you mention it again, I'll pour the rest down your throat. Arthur gave a tired chuckle. Fair enough. The fever left him weak for a few days, but in that weakness, something changed. Sophie found herself moving around the cabin differently, smoother, quieter, gentler, as though she no longer feared judgment in every step. She swept the floor without grumbling, patched a rip in his coat, aired out the blankets, humming under her breath. Arthur helped where he could. He chopped smaller logs, which was all his strength allowed. He fetched water from the creek. He tried awkwardly, honestly, to thank her with actions instead of words. One afternoon, as they shelled beans together on the porch, the silence shifted from mere coexistence into conversation. Real conversation. Arthur spoke first. My wife, he began, staring at the horizon. She died in a cabin much like this one. Fire took it. Took her. Took my little girl. I couldn't reach them in time. His hands tightened around the wooden bowl. The smoke came down the hallway like a living thing. I still hear them. Sometimes. Sophie's breath caught. No wonder he feared love inside these walls. No wonder he kept the place bare and cold. Love had burned him once literally, cruelly. I'm sorry, she whispered. No one should have to survive that. Arthur nodded once, jaw tight. You. She hesitated, thinking of bruises, slammed doors, her own screams swallowed into pillows so the neighbors wouldn't hear. My husband, he liked to drink, she said quietly. And when he drank, he liked to hit. I was returned to my mother, like faulty merchandise. She gave a humorless smile. Guess I was too bruised to be worth keeping. Arthur turned to look at her fully for the first time, really look at her. You weren't faulty, he said. He was. The words were simple, but they shook her. No one had ever said them out loud before. As the days passed, something warm began to build between them. Not a wildfire, not a sudden, passionate blaze. Something slower. A hearth fire. A quiet, steady brightness that made the cabin feel less like a cage of memories and more like a place where life might grow again. One evening, Sophie was mending Arthur's shirt when she pricked her finger and hissed in frustration. Arthur, carving a wooden spoon nearby, looked up. You all right? No, she grumbled, sucking her fingertip. I'm terrible at sewing. You're terrible at cooking too, he said with a straight face. Sophie glared. If I had the strength, I'd throw this needle at you. He set the spoon down. And yet, he said, voice softening, this cabin hasn't felt this alive since before. She stilled. Arthur reached over and gently, very gently took her pricked hand. His thumb brushed the reddened spot. Her breath caught at the intimacy of it. Sophie, he said, looking at her the way a fox looks at a sunrise he didn't expect to see again. You brought something back into this house, something I thought was gone for good. She swallowed, eyes warming. And what's that? Life. Her chest tightened. Arthur. He looked down at their joined hands. I told you I didn't want love in this house, he murmured. I thought it would curse me again. But he met her gaze, steady and vulnerable. I think I was wrong. Sophie felt a tremor of emotion roll through her. Her fear, hope, grief, longing, all tangled together. Arthur, she whispered, I thought I had nothing left to give. My first marriage took everything from me. But with you, I don't feel afraid. Not like before. He leaned closer, their foreheads nearly touching. Maybe two broken hearts mend better together, he said softly. Maybe, she breathed. Their lips met, not fierce, not rushed, and not wild. Just gentle, tentative. A promise whispered instead of shouted. A beginning instead of an ending. From that night on, the cabin felt different. Arthur laughed more often low, rare sounds that warmed Sophie from the inside out. Sophie smiled real smiles that softened her features and lit her eyes. They moved around each other like the steps of a familiar dance. She cooked with less salt. He repaired shelves and patched the roof with less slipping. They shared tasks, shared stories, shared quiet evenings on the porch while the desert ski faded from gold to purple. A kind of peace settled over them. A peace born from scars, not denial. A peace earned, not inherited. And quietly, so quietly neither of them dared name it, yet love began to grow. The years that followed settled softly over Sophie and Arthur, like slow falling snow on a winter mesa quiet, steady, patient. Their little cabin, once a hollow of grief and stubborn silence, grew warmer with each shared sunrise, each mended shingle, each quiet evening spent talking by lamplight. Sophie filled the shelves with small touches of comfort-woven cloths, dried flowers, a new quilt she stitched with clumsy but determined fingers. Arthur built her a larger table, then a proper pantry, then a rocking chair she claimed had too much wobble, though she rocked in it every night. Life, for once, felt kind. And then came the day Sophie discovered she was pregnant. Arthur froze when she told him, hands still dusty from the field, hat half off his head. His breath shuddered. Fear flickered. First old fear, from the fire, but then something deeper replaced it. Hope. Real, trembling hope. When their twins were born, a sturdy boy and a loud, rosy-cheeked girl, Arthur Seatful quietly, Sophie almost didn't notice. He held the babies as though afraid they might vanish into soot, kissing their tiny foreheads with reverence. This time, he whispered, voice thick, fires won't touch what I love. Sophie rested her hand on his cheek. We're safe, Arthur. We're home. By the winter, their twins turned 2. A letter arrived from town. Sloane was getting married. Her groom was a white merchant from Santa Fe, a kind, steady man with soft manners and even softer eyes. This time no one whispered about status or beauty or gold. It was simply a good match. Sophie and Arthur rode into town for the ceremony, the twins bundled in Sophie's arms like 2 noisy packages. Inside the church, Sloane looked beautiful, not the glittery, perfect kind she used to strive for, but a calmer beauty, softened by years and mistakes understood rather than resented. After the vows, she approached Sophie with a tentative smile. You look happy, Sloane said softly. Sophie returned the smile. I am. Sloane's gaze shifted to Arthur, who was showing their son how to tug at his hat brim, like a proper cowboy. A faint laugh escaped her. Arthur suits you. I see it now. Sophie touched her sister's arm. And your husband suits you. Sloane hesitated, then took a slow breath. You know, back then I was jealous. I won't lie about it. I thought beauty should earn me everything. I thought life owed me something, just for being young and pretty. Her eyes softened with something like humility. But growing up teaches you that beauty doesn't carry a home. It doesn't heal a heart. It doesn't keep a man warm through the hard winters. Sophie listened, patient, gentle. Sloane's voice wavered. Back then, I asked why Arthur chose you. Now I understand. You had strength no mirror could ever show. She swallowed, blinking away a tear. I judged you poorly. I'm sorry, Sophie. Sophie drew her sister into a quiet embrace. We were both younger then. We both had our battles. When they pulled apart, Sloane touched Sophie's cheek with unexpected tenderness. You found the right man, she said. And this time, I think I did too. Snow drifted over Black Mesa that Christmas Eve, settling on rooftops and fence posts, blanketing the world in quiet silver. The little cabin glowed with lamplight, warm and golden against the cold. Arthur carried firewood in his arms as the twins scattered wooden toys across the floor, like wild puppies. Sophie stirred a pot of stew, humming a tune that had become familiar to all of them. When Arthur stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots, Sophie looked up. You're letting in the cold, she chided gently. Arthur grinned, the way he grinned only for her. Cold doesn't stand a chance in this house. He walked over, slipped an arm around her waist and kissed her cheek. She leaned into him, letting the warmth of him settle through her. Hard to believe, she murmured. I once thought my life was over. Arthur glanced at the twins now tugging at his pant legs, and then at the home they had built, piece by imperfect piece. I once thought my heart was too burnt to feel again, he said quietly. But you proved me wrong. Sophie rested her forehead against his. We healed each other, Arthur. He cupped her face with both hands, eyes soft as dusk over the mesa. "Gold wasn't the treasure I found," he whispered. "You were." Sophie smiled, eyes glowing in the lamplight. "And you were the home I thought I'd never have." Outside, snowflakes whispered against the window pane. Inside, laughter from the twins mingled with the crackle of the fire. Two broken souls, once lost, once unwanted, now held a life warm enough to outshine the darkest nights. And that Christmas Eve, with their children curled beside them and the fire glowing bright, Arthur and Sophie Greyhawk knew something with absolute certainty. They had finally found where they belonged, together, for good. And so, beneath the quiet hush of the mesa winds, Arthur and Sophie found the kind of peace only two healed hearts can share. Their journey reminds us that even in the roughest lands, love finds its way home. If you enjoyed this story, please hit subscribe, like, share, and leave a comment so I can bring you even more tales. Thank you all for listening.